Welcome to Humble Beginnings, a podcast where we uncover the unconventional, more relatable paths to success. In this show, we'll share the stories before the C-suites, board memberships, and appointments, the stories of various upbringings, first jobs, career pivots, educational uncertainties, and more. This is the place to hear about their lives from the GovCon executives themselves. We hope you enjoy. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Humble Beginnings. I'm your host, Amanda Ziede, and our guest today is Aarish Gokaldas, CEO of Highlight. Thank you so much for joining us today, Aarish.
Thank you for having me, Amanda. I'm happy to be here.
Of course. So on our show, we typically like to start with a bit about your background. Aarish, I understand that you and your family are Indian and you grew up in South Africa. Can you start by sharing a bit about your family history?
Absolutely, yeah. So my family's originally from Gujarat in India. However, they immigrated to Northern Africa in the late 1800s to Ethiopia and Eritrea, and then slowly started migrating south and eventually landed in Johannesburg, South Africa, Johannesburg and Durban. And that's where my sisters and I were born. I was the youngest of five, born in South Africa in 1979 during the Apartheid era, where there were certainly political and racial divisions there. And so that's where we settled, and that's where we were.
All right. And I understand that you were only a child during this time, but can you share a bit about what that experience was like growing up in apartheid South Africa and how that impacted your upbringing?
Absolutely, yeah. So certainly living in Johannesburg at the time, and you're right, I was there until the age of 6. But there are certainly memories that I have, vivid memories. And just for everyone's background, apartheid in South Africa, they had different classes of people based on their ethnicity. So obviously, white South Africans were at the top. Indians were next, and then followed by a group they called colored, right? So individuals that were mixed race. And then last was Black South Africans. So they certainly practiced a policy of political segregation, right? Separate schools, separate beaches, separate playgrounds, bathrooms, water fountains. And this was the lived experience for my family and all other minorities in South Africa. We were fortunate enough that we had a successful business while we were there. But there was, again, a lot of social upheaval at the time. There was a lot of political violence. Certainly, South Africa itself was caught up in an international dispute with other countries that were pushing them to end the policy of apartheid, as there were internally, right? As we were as well internally trying to push for the end to that. So there was a lot of social violence. There was a lot of political violence at the time. And so certainly from my perspective, growing up within that environment made it a paramount priority for me to ensure that that would never be an experience that I would live through again, or I would allow to live within, or an experience I would ever foster in any community or organization that I was a part of.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we'll get to that perspective a bit later as well, but such a unique experience to have as a child. And I'm sure it impacts you differently, it sticks with you for the remainder of your life. So appreciate you sharing that with us.
Of course. Yeah, no, it was certainly, I was young, but it was a formative part of my upbringing, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely. So when and why did your family then decide to come to the States?
Yeah, so when I was 6 years old, I would say that apartheid was probably at the point of its decline and finally coming toward an end. It would still be several years before it was formally abolished as a political system, a political tool. But at that point, South Africa was putting measures in place that were devaluing the currency, that were making it a lot harder for citizens, especially non-white citizens, to survive, let alone thrive in the community. So my parents made the decision at that point to emigrate to the United States. And it was a really, I would say, risky and serious decision, because at the time, South Africa had put a policy in place that residents could not remove any capital out of South Africa. So they essentially were forced to leave South Africa without any of their savings, any of their investments, and essentially leave that in the hands of those who they trusted and other family members and other friends and their employees. And so we moved at that point to Texas, of all places, to a small town in Texas called Brownwood. And that's where I was for about 3 years before we then relocated, and where I ultimately had my remainder of my childhood in Tampa, Florida.
Right. I find immigration stories fascinating, but also extremely important to share. My family also immigrated to the States, so I love to ask these questions. What it was like starting over in a new country, and the decisions and the why, and what you left behind. I think it's so important. So many families in this country today are the descendants of immigrants. So
Absolutely, and you understand. I mean, the type of decision making that has to go into the process, right? I mean, for my parents, it was absolutely for the sake of their 5 kids, right? That's what they've said. And look, I'd love to say that I would be brave enough if I saw the need for my kids to move out of a country with no savings, no income, no identified path forward in the new country. I don't know that I could do that. So I have such a tremendous amount of respect and admiration for my mother and father for making that decision and coming here and making a future for themselves, not knowing what it would be.
mm-hmm. Absolutely, I share those same sentiments. It's amazing to me.
Mm-hmm.
So what was it like for your parents and for you starting over in a completely new country?
Yeah, it was definitely an adjustment, right? There was obviously huge differences between growing up in what was Central Texas and being in South Africa. Not the least of which was the language, the food choices. We were mesmerized and amazed by this wonderful restaurant called Taco Bell that became like our almost safe haven that we would go to. But my parents coming here, and I think you'll find that for a lot of immigrant South Asians like ourselves, immigrant Indians, the most likely and the easiest business to get into is motel management. It's one of the easier ones to secure a loan to either purchase or build a motel. So that's the business that my family went into, right? In South Africa, we managed a clothing retail shop. So it was a huge departure from what they previously had done. They had to learn how to manage a motel, manage the finances associated with it. And ultimately, it ended up being a failure in Brownwood. They purchased a motel, hoping to turn it around, and we were never able to. And that's why we ultimately sold it and moved. But again, it was yet another lesson in resiliency and moving forward. And so, growing up in Brownwood for me personally, I can only imagine that the reason they picked the town is because it had the word brown in it, um, assuming that there'd be more Indian folks there, but we were one of 2 Indian families. So it was an interesting perspective where we left a country with essentially apartheid written into the Constitution and coming into one where everyone is created equal, but there was still that sense of being different and being pointed out for being different. So jumping into that similar scenario where there are these undercurrents of racial tension, and it was interesting to see that hearing everything about the United States on land of equality, land of the free, and then seeing that, and then seeing on the counter those individuals that were on the flip side incredibly welcoming and helped us integrate and helped us adjust to the school system, adjust to the new food options, the huge supermarkets. So both sides of the spectrum we got to see.
Mm-hmm. Such an important perspective to share, in my opinion, because not everyone gets to see both sides, especially. So
Yeah.
So, how did you eventually land in Tampa? Did your family decide to start a business there after the failed attempt?
That's right. Yeah. So once it became clear that the motel in Brownwood was not working out, my father and my grandfather, who had also come to the U.S., essentially went east to look at a couple of properties that were for sale, one in Jacksonville and one in Tampa. And they eventually landed on a Howard Johnson in Tampa, which had the iconic orange roof that still stands out for so many. And so we purchased that motel in Tampa and moved in 1988 when I was 9 years old to Florida, and that's essentially where I grew up with my four sisters, and I was there till I graduated high school.
And what was life like for you growing up in Tampa in grade school?
So Tampa was a huge departure from Brownwood, right? It was a major city in Florida, highly diverse. So had a diverse group of friends. There was a large Indian population, which was important for my parents, right? For them to sort of retain a connection to their culture, to their community, and so we were able to remain engaged there. But for me, it was a great opportunity to kind of start to figure out my identity, where my place was, both in the family, but also within the world and where it is I wanted to go and what it is I wanted to do. And along the process, build out my own community that again was one that was incredibly diverse, with individuals that were welcoming of everyone, regardless of race, ethnicity, sexual orientation. So Tampa was a great experience, and it was a great place to grow up, I'd say.
What were your interests like? Did you play sports, or did you work at all during your adolescence, or extracurriculars?
Oh yeah, no, I definitely worked. That was drilled into me. I mean, I worked at the motel, helped out there, cleaning the pool, sometimes helping out at the front desk. My first job was at the age of 14, where I was a bag boy for Publix supermarkets. Did that, eventually adjusted or got promoted into a cashier role my senior year. So I was able to do all that. Interest, I was a huge tennis player. So I played tennis all through high school, as well as cross country. So remaining engaged there. And then I was also a gigantic, and still am, a huge math nerd. And I'm proud to say it's something that my son takes after. So I was a member of the math club. I competed in Saturday math competitions, as well as went to the state math competition in Orlando, Florida. So I definitely had that the nerdy side of me as well. But yeah, no, I got to essentially have the experience of hanging out, participating in a lot of different extracurricular activities, but also that responsibility of having the job, and starting from the bottom and building my way up.
Yep. Awesome. So at this point in life, I guess maybe before college, you've had many changes and transformational and impactful changes in your life, especially as a child. How do these experiences kind of impact your interests and the way you viewed life and perhaps your perspective at this point?
Great question, Amanda. I think one of the biggest things that it built in me was having come from South Africa, having the opportunity to go back there to visit when I was 8, having the opportunity to travel from South Africa to America, explore America, traveling within the country, going to see the Grand Canyon, heading up to Toronto to see, heading up to Canada to see Niagara Falls, going to Toronto, sightseeing there. It just developed this strong love of sort of international engagement, world travel, wanting to experience as many cultures as I could. I started taking Spanish around the 3rd grade, developed a certain level of fluency by high school. Senior year of the summer before senior year, I was fortunate enough to receive a scholarship to study abroad in Japan for a summer. Lived in Okinawa, which is where the U.S. Marine base is located, and got to experience sort of from the other side their viewpoint of America, their viewpoint of the U.S. military, and some of the tensions there, and sort of learn again the standpoint from a different culture, from a different country, and so that in me sort of drove me toward a love for international relations, and that's where I sort of honed in on from a collegiate search of looking to go into.
Wow. That is a lot of travel and cultural experiences before 21.
Yeah, again, I was very fortunate to have those experiences.
Mhm. How many languages do you speak?
Oh, I mean, currently I would say just English and Spanish,
Okay.
and I can understand Gujarati. I won't say I can speak it.
Okay. I was wondering if you
I
picked
can
up
do a
any.
smattering of Japanese at this point, perhaps, but
Mhm. Cool. Just wanted to ask. I was like,
yeah.
wonder if you picked up
Yeah,
any
I love
Japanese.
languages, and I wish I kept up on it, but I ended up doing about 2 years of Japanese total between high school and college, but I have not practiced it recently.
I can relate. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's tough. All right. So you mentioned you went to Georgetown to study international affairs, and it's clear to see where that passion and interest came from. Did you have any impactful work experiences during college, perhaps related to your major or otherwise?
Yeah, so certainly impactful work experiences, not necessarily related to my major, but my first when I joined, when I went to Georgetown, certainly it was on a financial aid. As I mentioned, the initial venture with the motel in Brownwood was not successful. Unfortunately, Howard Johnson was not as successful either. But again, to my parents' credit, they evolved, they pivoted, and they actually secured a loan to build a new motel in Houston, Texas. And so they built a motel and actually relocated to Houston my senior year. I stayed in Tampa to finish my high school uh, education, and then as part of that, I went up to Georgetown on student loans, as well as an expectation to work, an additional a job or two to help sort of pay for my tuition and books and lodging. So for my first year, I took on a job teaching after school programs within Southeast DC, which is one of the more underfunded and impoverished neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. And so I went there every 3 days a week after their school programs from like 3:30 to 6, and would basically teach English and math. And that essentially led into joining the AmeriCorps program, which is a U.S. government-funded program to assist communities, both in physical, like developing houses, development programs, but also education. So I became an AmeriCorps member for the year of 1999, and essentially taught after school programs during the school year, and then over the summer actually lived in one of the apartments in Southeast DC alongside my students and would teach summer school with them. So that was, again, a wonderful experience. It was a great opportunity for me to interact with, a group that has, I'll say, a unique cultural identity that I wasn't familiar with, that they allowed me to sort of come in and learn and absorb some of. But just as importantly, it was a great opportunity for them to engage in an Indian American who they've never met before, and learn more about my culture, my background, kind of what was important to me, what my values were in life, and some of it aligned, some of it didn't. But it was a great, not just education opportunity for them or for me, but also a great cultural exchange opportunity, right? To show me that, look, you don't need to go to Japan to have this. It's a simple matter of just going down the street and engaging and interacting, right? In the classroom, at the grocery store, on the basketball court, with your students, with their parents. It was a wonderful opportunity. And then the only other job I'll talk to is that for whatever reason, I think it was more of a challenge to see if we could do it. My college roommate and I both signed up to be newspaper delivery boys, men at this point, I guess, to deliver newspapers across Georgetown University's campus. And this was something we took on our sophomore year. So it was basically doing AmeriCorps during the day, after school, and then in the mornings at 5 a.m., waking up every morning at 5 a.m., a sophomore at college, and delivering about 200 Washington Post newspapers across the campus. And that was every day, including Saturday morning and Sunday morning. And I don't mind telling you, Amanda, there were a few days where I overslept because of the previous night's festivities. And usually, Georgetown is a Jesuit school, and it includes Jesuits that live in residence in some of the dormitories. And there would always be, if we were 30 minutes late or 40 minutes late, one of the Jesuits standing outside waiting for his paper. And we were always very apologetic, but that was an amazing experience. And I could say that while we were occasionally late in our delivery, we never missed a delivery day.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
I was going to ask. I mean, I could hardly get up for 8 a.m. classes, so that's very impressive.
I can only assume that it was a challenge that we set for ourselves to just see if we could do it. And we did not return the following semester.
I don't blame you.
Yeah.
And I also wanted to point to something, we were talking earlier about our parents and how it's amazing the courage they had to uproot their whole family and move somewhere for the sake of their children and their future. The resiliency also is something to note. I mean, having businesses not go the way you want and still trying and figuring ways around it is also something that I think would be really hard for me to do at this point in my life. And I can't imagine that type of resiliency.
Absolutely. And I can with much satisfaction say that it had a happy ending, right? The third motel that they built up based on their vision eventually was successful. They ran it for 20 years, sold it in the mid 2000s. They asked me to take over managing it, and I told them that was the farthest thing from what I wanted to do. So they sold it, and they were able to pay off their loan and use the funds from the sale to fund their retirement. So yeah.
Awesome. That's great to hear. My parents also want us to take over their business, and 3 siblings, and we're not into it. But
And what was that? What was that business?
It's a flower shop. It's
very
cool, very beautiful, but not for us. So I understand.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, tell us about your first job offer during your senior year at Georgetown. I understand there's a bit of a story with this. You're preparing for a dream job, but it didn't go as planned. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so I mentioned that I was looking into international affairs. My goal heading into Georgetown was to become a foreign service officer, travel the world, get a posting every 3 to 5 years in a different country. And as I progressed in my education, I received more of an introduction to the intelligence community and learned a lot about their mission as well. And I was at Georgetown. My senior year was 2001, so I was, in my dorm on 9/11, and we were able to see the Pentagon from the rooftop. And I will say, as it was for many people, that certainly provided additional color around what it is I wanted to do. Right? There was certainly a sense of it had a very sobering effect, but it also had a sense of, well, okay, what can you do about it? And so I had the opportunity my senior year to attend one of the Georgetown career fairs, and the Defense Intelligence Agency was there. I met with their recruiter, learned more about their mission, and applied. This was 2001, and in December of 2001, my senior year, I received a contingent offer letter. Was overjoyed, signed it immediately, went through the necessary security clearance process, received my security clearance approval about 5 to 6 months later, and graduated in May of 2002. The day I graduated, I remember I went back to my dorm room. I contacted the recruiter and said, when do I start? I just graduated. When can I start? And they said, well, the government has just placed a hiring freeze on all billets at DIA, so we cannot offer a start date now, but we will contact you. Stay by your phone. And so that was disappointing, but in my mind, I was like, okay, it'll be 1 week, 2 weeks, maybe at most the summer, and I'll use that time to go visit my 4 sisters who are spread around the country and spend time with them. Come 6 months later, the hiring freeze was still in effect. There was still no job offer coming. And that's where I started to, at this point, I was living in Boston, working at a Barnes & Noble as a bookseller is what the official term was, and figuring out what I was going to do next. And that's where I was in October of 2002.
Wow. So what did you end up doing? How did you end up spending your time during this hiring freeze?
Yeah, so I started thinking through, okay, if this job doesn't come through, what are the next options? I could go through and take the foreign service exam and go down that road, go down that route, but I wasn't necessarily wed to doing the foreign service officer position anymore. My dream job as a third grader until sixth grade was to become a lawyer, and so I thought through that, and I was like, yeah, I could still do the law thing. So I studied and took the LSAT and decided to apply to a handful of universities, but those wouldn't start until September of 2002. So that left me a good 10 months with which I had free time, right? And I could have stayed in Boston and continued to work at Barnes and Noble, which was enough to cover rent. But then I spoke with one of my friends, the same friend that I did the delivery job with for the Washington Post. He, after college, took 3 weeks off and traveled through Southeast Asia and East Asia and ended up in Beijing. And he said, if you're not doing anything, why don't you come, quote unquote, do nothing here in Beijing? And I thought about it, and he picked up a job teaching English. And I said, okay, that's an experience I'm never going to get to do once I get fully employed or once I start law school. So why don't I do that? So I purchased a one-way ticket to Beijing. I had enough funds to procure that ticket. Uh, Flew in, dropped off my bags at my friend's apartment, and from there we went immediately to the Great Wall of China and spent the weekend at a hostel on the Great Wall. Came back, and then that Monday I sort of hit the pavement and started looking for jobs, and ended up picking up 4 or 5 jobs teaching English to students, young professionals, and business executives for about 6 months.
Awesome. What a culturally enriching way to spend doing nothing in Beijing.
It was
That's,
fantastic. Yeah,
yeah.
it really provided a lot of value in that I went from teaching one-on-one students classes of 5 to 10 people to speaking in auditoriums for like 300 to 400 people. So from that perspective, it helped me gain a lot more confidence. In that perspective, I certainly picked up an additional language. I learned how to, order in a bar. I learned how to negotiate in a store, direct in a taxi, and talk trash in a basketball court. So, all the important elements of the language that I needed. So it was a wonderful experience. And again, what happened with DIA at the time was incredibly disappointing. But I wouldn't have it any other way now, right? I mean, the ability from what I learned from my parents to pivot and move toward something else was great. And in that period, I received an acceptance letter from Boston College to go to law school there. And so I essentially set a path to stay in Beijing until the summer of 2022, return and attend law school.
Awesome. So what did happen when you returned?
So SARS happened. SARS hit Beijing, spread. Everything went into lockdown in March of 2002, April of 2002. All bars, restaurants, movie theaters, and classrooms were closed. So at this point, I couldn't go out. I couldn't uh, teach. If anybody in my apartment building came down with SARS, the Beijing government was locking down quarantining the entire building. And I'm a lacto-vegetarian, so I wasn't really comfortable with them providing me my 3 square meals a day. So I decided to return to the U.S. And just figure out what I would do for the remainder of the summer before going to law school. So I remember vividly, it was April 19th of 2002. I got on a plane and flew back to New York City, where one of my sisters was living at the time. We go back to her apartment. I set my bag down, and about 30 minutes later, her cell phone rings, and she answers it. And she says, "It's for you," to me. So I pick the phone, and it's the recruiter from the Defense Intelligence Agency. And she says, "Hey, great news. The freeze has been lifted. Your job is ready."
That is the most timely, almost like serendipitous situation. It
It
seems
was
like to,
unbelievable. Yeah.
wow.
Yeah. And so I was overjoyed. And so I started in May of 2002, a month later. A month after returning, I started with the Defense Intelligence Agency as an intelligence officer. I eventually withdrew my application from Boston College and never went to law school.
Right. That's wow. I want to talk a minute about your adaptability. I know you mentioned you had learned from your parents the ability to pivot on a moment's notice and kind of switch your mindset a bit more positively when things don't go your way. Um, how did that come in handy during all of these transitions? Because I'm sure when you came back to the States during SARS, you weren't expecting this call. Were you still in good spirits? I mean, how are you planning on, I guess, moving forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've never looking, if I were to assess myself, I would never have really identified myself as someone who adapts to change well. But looking back at the experiences, I think that certainly my parents equipped me with a certain set of skills to adapt to big changes, right? And so going to China, for example, I've had the privilege of traveling, and I've never really experienced true culture shock until I got there. I experienced real culture shock. I didn't speak the language. I was not familiar with how to order vegetarian items off the menus. I wasn't familiar with how to navigate around the city, which was massive and dense, and heavily populated and with a lot of traffic. So the first 2 months were incredible culture shock. I'm obviously the ability to overcome that and start to find the positive in the experience and really enjoy my time there and develop a love both for the city, for the people, and the culture, right? Was a key win for me. And then to your point, coming back from China, I would say I was still in fairly good spirits because there was still a path laid out for me
Right.
post September, and that summer was the one question mark. And then certainly the call from DIA was serendipitous, right? So it's almost as if I'm not necessarily a big believer in fate, but it was almost like someone somewhere had something planned out, right? That the fact that the timing worked out so perfectly, that not only was I able to uh, get the job with DIA that I'd been holding on since 18 months previous, I was able to take advantage of a 6-month international work abroad as well.
True. Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. So
Yeah.
this might be kind of a big question, but briefly describe your career to follow, your experience at DIA and how it led to other opportunities, eventually leading you to Highlight. But we can get to that after. But yeah, talk us a bit through the progression of your career.
Yeah, happy to. So within DIA, I was hired as an intelligence officer within their MASN and technical education branch. So MASN is measurement and signature intelligence. So it's highly technical intelligence. And I was brought in to help develop the curriculum for how we build MASN sensors, how we collect MASN data, and how users can actually utilize the data. And what was really interesting is that my experience within China prepared me really well for this role, unbeknownst to them and unbeknownst to me, because coming in, there was obviously the requirement to build the curriculum, but one of the things that I put forward was, hey, I'm happy to deliver this curriculum too. I've been doing it. I've been teaching English in front of crowds of all varying sizes. I can do the same thing here. So as part of that, we put together. I along with the branch, put together a 1-day class, a 1-week class, as well as a 3-week class, 3-week program for intelligence professionals, both within DIA as well as across the other 3-letter agencies and the military schoolhouses. So, we traveled to San Angelo to teach at Goodfellow, within the Air Force training school there, out to Fort Huachuca in Arizona for the Army training school. So it was a great opportunity for me to leverage some of the experience and the confidence that I gained from working in front of classroom settings to do this, for the military and civilian agencies. And so I was able to do that for about 2 years. And then I transitioned to doing it full time for the DIA Schoolhouse, the Joint Military Intelligence Training Center. And in that capacity, I switched over from federal to a government contractor working with SAIC. And so I continued to, deliver the 1 day and the 1 week training programs. But now I was doing it, at different smaller schoolhouses, right? So I was still doing it out down at Goodfellow. I was doing it out in London, in Hawaii, as well as out in Washington, Fort Lewis. So again, it was a great opportunity for me to travel, an opportunity to continue to deliver curriculum and engage with students, and it was a wonderful experience.
So what eventually led you to Highlight?
Yeah, great question. So in 2008, I joined a small business called OG Systems. I joined as employee number 8. And in that period, I started supporting as a consultant to one of their key contracts at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, NGA. And then we're talking alongside this theme of pivot, which is great. I didn't even realize we'd get to this kind of theme, but I came in, and within the first month, they said, "What is it that you want to do? We hired you to do this work. It's exciting work. What do you want to do?" And I said, "I'd really love to get engaged with your business development and help grow the company." They said, "Done." They gave me the tools. They gave me, the minimum level of training, and they said, "Go, build work where you can, meet with clients how you want to, identify and lock in partners." So, for the first 2 years, I was sort of working independently to do that, to grow the company as I saw fit, right? With check-ins with the CEO and the president. And we continued to double in size each year. And then by year 5 of my time there in 2013, 2014, we had grown to the size where it was necessary for me to come off contract and do that full time, which I was definitely excited about, right? Getting to have one full-time job as opposed to 2. And focus on that fully, and taking on initially the head of BD, and then eventually the chief growth officer role, and eventually we grew to a sufficient size where it made sense to look at the next stage of the company, and that's when we were acquired by Parsons Corporation in 2019. And then within Parsons, I took over as CEO at OG Systems to help manage the transition in, and then agreed to stand up Parsons Space and Geospatial Solutions business unit, which was and is a great organization, right? Focused around a lot of what OG Systems did, but a lot of what Parsons continues to do alongside some of their other strategic acquisitions. So we stood that up, successfully transitioned all of the contracts in there, grew it significantly. And at that point, I wanted to sort of move into that next phase of my career. And having been, a CEO for a short period at OG Systems, an executive at Parsons for a couple of years, that was something that I never saw myself moving into. But as I was growing into it, it was a challenge that I was certainly excited about. And that's where Highlight came into play. Highlight is an incredible organization that's 15 years old. It was established as a woman-owned small business and 8A service small disadvantaged business that rapidly grew out of small business status, and in the last 2 years has converted to a 100% employee-owned company. And looking at where I wanted to go next, there were a couple of things that were of great importance to me, and this comes back to my formative upbringing, a focus around diversity, a focus around equity, and a focus around inclusion. Having grown up in communities where exclusion was the name of the game, that was something that had to be there. It was not something that I wanted to come in and have to force. And Highlight absolutely fit that to a T. It's an organization that is minority majority, so 53% of the population at Highlight is a minority. It is 62% female. And more importantly, that's represented within the leadership that was already here before I joined, right? So 62% female, 70% minority in the leadership roles. And then the other one was a focus on the employee. And certainly the commitment to the ESOP, every employee has ownership in the company, is just one of the several examples that drew me in. So I was happy to come in and assume the role as CEO from Rebecca Andino, who moved into the chairperson role. And so I've been in the spot for about 4 months now, and it's been a great experience. And everything that I believed to be true about the company has thus far proven itself out. Not to mention the world-class capabilities that they have within health, defense, and homeland security.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Yeah. Now that you're a bit settled, and as you mentioned, there are lots of parallels between the values of the company and those of your own. Are there any other that you've noticed since sitting the CEO chair for a couple months now?
Yes, for sure. Obviously, we talked about the diversity, an employee-first culture. I, I, I I said it. We talked about it back when I was at OG Systems. How do you define success as a servant leader? The term servant leadership. How do you define success as a servant leader? And in my opinion, you define it as every employee being able to say, at the end of the day, my company cares about me. And that can be via the consistent uh, across the board compensation, benefits, stock ownership, 401k. But then it also comes into those little things, right? How are we rewarding employees for individual contributions that go above and beyond? And we have an internal program called Bucket List where employees can recognize each other, and those recognitions can be converted to actual gift cards. They can be converted to donations to their favorite causes. We do it by supporting and sponsoring employees' passion service projects, providing funds to support those projects, providing the manpower. So we have community service opportunities and engagement opportunities going on every month, every quarter, and so doing what we are able to do. Obviously, the big things that employees need to make sure that they have what they need to have a quality of life, but also doing the little things to ensure that they're able to thrive in their roles and not just survive.
Awesome. So, bit of a reflective question. Since you've been a CEO twice now in your career, and as you mentioned, an executive prior, have you exceeded expectations that you originally set for yourself, maybe in college or high school, or I guess whenever you start thinking about what you want to be, end goal, although it's not the end, but um, or have you then placed more aspirations to follow?
Yeah. So have I exceeded goals? I'd say that I'm very happy with where I've come. It's never where I thought I would be. If you had ever asked me if CEO was something that I strive for, I would say hard no, hard pass. This is something that I never want to take on. It was never a passion project for me to oversee the care and feeding of employees, right? Ensuring their satisfaction, right? My passion was around growing and succeeding, and frankly, uh, it's something that I've come to love. And what I'll say is, I think what you find is that individuals that don't necessarily strive for the CEO role tend to do it a little better because I feel like they have something to prove, right? Those who are in the role want to make sure that they're not who are sure that they should be in that role are committed to overperforming because they don't want to fall into that trap of imposter syndrome of being seen as a fake. So in that sense, it's a huge driver for me to make sure that I'm successful, not just for the sake of the company, but for selfish reasons to say that I'm able to do it. But in terms of exceeding expectations, my goal is to empower the company, empower the employees, and make sure that they're all successful. And however Highlight does, and as successful as we are, I want them to see as much success, both in terms of their professional development, in terms of their career development, but also in terms of their financial development. So when we talk about that stock ownership plan, that's a huge feature within Highlight, where every employee, once they reach eligibility, is going to get a share in the organization. So my goal is to make them wealthy, right? And so I haven't met that goal yet, and that's sort of North Star.
Cool. Awesome. And to close, I love to end with this because considering your experiences, the way you've had to pivot in your career and change your mindset, do you have any advice for the next generation of leaders, based on these experiences that you've encountered?
Yeah, I think one came out of necessity, and that one is we've talked about it throughout this conversation, Amanda, is adapt, a willingness to adapt, right? Certainly, again, I'm not going to say that I in any way had a hard upbringing, but I had to pivot, right? When the offer from DIA came through, there was a requirement to adapt. For me, that was going and working at Barnes& Noble for a period and moving over to law school and taking the advantage of going abroad and finding a job there. It wasn't where I thought I would be. It was where I eventually went, and I went with an open mind and a positive outlook. And frankly, I was fortunate enough that I was able to afford that ticket to go out there, right, and then afford the ticket to come back. And it was a great experience. And that probably leads me into my second piece of advice is take the time to figure out what it is you want to do. I'm a huge I was so incredibly focused on going from college into my professional career, that had everything worked out, I would have missed out on that opportunity for what ended up being a forced gap year, and it ended up being a huge benefit to me, such that been able to take that experience forward and start work at DIA with this renewed enthusiasm and vigor. So if anyone is in the position to do so, I would highly encourage taking that period, taking that break between whether it's military service and your career, or your formal education and a career. Take that time, do something that you're passionate about, do something that is going to stretch your horizon, is going to take you outside of your comfort zone, and then come back and see if that what you were looking to do is in fact what you want to do.
Awesome. I think growing up in high school, middle school, college, you think there's people who want to, be in business or the C-suite, have a clear defined path, and you have to get this job and continue climbing the corporate ladder. But if there's something I learned from these interviews, that is rarely the case for many people sitting in positions like yours. So it's fascinating to hear how you got from A to B, and I appreciate you sharing that story and a bit about your family and your background. That perspective is so important to share.
Of course, no, it was great, and I thank you for the opportunity for letting me tell that story.
Of course. Thanks so much for sharing, and I appreciate you being here. Thanks, Aarish.
Thank you, Amanda.
Like what you hear? Make sure to subscribe to Humble Beginnings on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and get notified when new episodes are released. Thanks for listening.